Whether it's a film like Saving Private Ryan or a memoir like With the Old Breed, the temptation to romanticize war and the Second World War in particular is part of American life. Today's guest made sense of her own experience in the Iraq War by understanding her grandfather's service more than 70 years ago. She's Tara Copp, this week on Story in the Public Square. Hello and welcome to Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. I'm Jim Ludis from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University. Alongside me is my friend and co-host G. Wayne Miller from the Providence Journal. Story in the Public Square is an effort to study, celebrate, and tell stories that matter. We do that by sitting down with authors, journalists, really storytellers in any medium who have something to say about the issues facing the United States today. Today's guest is Tara Copp. An accomplished journalist, she's currently the Pentagon Bureau Chief for the Military Times and author of The Warbird, a moving memoir of her experience in Iraq, her grandfather and great-uncle's service in World War II, and a reflection on the stories we tell about the wars our nation fights. Tara, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So we want to talk about the book, we want to talk about your grandfather, we want to talk about the men that you went into Iraq with, but let's start with you. You were one of a handful of female reporters who embedded with U.S. forces in the Iraq War in 2003. Why did you volunteer for that assignment?
At the time, I was the Washington correspondent for 4 Texas newspapers. They were all Texas small towns, and they were all military towns. And the men and women at 3 Air Force bases and 3 Navy bases, they were all heading to war. And I wanted to go with them. I felt like I had a duty to go with them.
So when you look back on that experience and the sort of the experience of the embed program, how successful was that in capturing that war and telling that story?
Actually, DoD has done a lot of they'll call it an after-action review, but essentially it's just a how'd we do. And they loved having that embed program. You know, they had extended 776 invitations to reporters, about 550 accepted. 550 reporters embedding, you know, with the ground forces, more than 100,000 strong, going into Iraq from various aspects, from the air. Some were on ships, some were, you know, in ground units. You saw them in the personnel carriers. They got this whole, it was a comprehensive picture, but it was also very soda-strawed because each reporter was, all right, this is my unit and this is what we're doing. And then there were some that actually were at headquarters and trying to get that strategic level. But overall, they actually measured, and the Pentagon does this all the time, they measured their coverage. And they found that overall it was overwhelmingly positive, because when you had these interactions one-on-one with soldiers and you wanted to tell their story, it more often at that close level became a positive story rather than the here's everything that's going wrong.
Interesting.
Was there any censorship when you were filing stories? And then I want to hear how you were filing stories from that somewhat distant era.
I never had censorship. I actually had a surprising amount of access. I started out at an Air Force base, so in the shock and awe, I was right there on the flight line watching aircraft take off. Actually, no, I'll take that back. There was one censorship thing. At the very, very onset, they were F-117s taking off from this base that I was at. And they asked us not to report that these aircraft were launching from here.
Stealth fighters.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But other than that, you didn't have to submit your stories for review?
No.
Or so you talked about how you were working for Texas newspapers, mm-hmm. and the war happens and you decide to go. You almost casually said you decided to go. Did you have any fears, any qualms? I mean, emotionally, you know, here you are going into war, here you are going into combat of a kind we haven't seen ever, and you might not make it.
I had the luxury of naivete and just youth, I guess.
How old were you at that time?
At the time I was 28.
Okay.
So not that young. Certainly older than the young men and women who fought our previous wars, the 21-year-olds that did World War II and Korea and Vietnam. But we'd also had this extended period of relative peace. And so nobody knew what a war really could do to you. You know, even with the first Gulf War, which I, wrote about as a high school senior when we saw those initial images from CNN coming off on the TV, and our English teacher had us write about it. It was just this, well, war's clean and it's distant, and you come home after 3 days. That was the 72-hour war.
Right.
Now we're in a 16-year war. The experience is completely different. The people who have experienced it, they've brought those wounds home. And I think that knowing now, what has happened to the men and women and what happened to me, and it's just, maybe I would have been afraid, but I wasn't at the time.
We've had a guest on this program, Michael Corkery, who is with the New York Times now, and he's not writing about military affairs, but he was at the Providence Journal at the time of this war, and he was probably almost exactly your age, and he was one of those people who was embedded as well, and he sort of had the same attitude. It's like, he partly saw it as adventure, he partly saw it as service to his country in a way, and journalistically he saw it as a challenge. But I remember he used to file stories sometimes by satellite phone from the back of a tank during combat or right after combat. How did you file your stories?
Same way.
See, this is so cavalier. And he was the same way on the phone. It's like, yeah, what you hear in the background is firing, but I want you to, update. And crazy.
Everybody had a job to do, and that was my job. So I was mostly afraid of, once you get the satellite phone out and you have it on this tripod, am I going to get a signal? Because I really need that signal to work. And then is my story going to go through?
So you're thinking as a journalist?
Yeah, you're thinking they've sent me over here to do this job, and I need to do it.
So was there any special preparation that you received to be an embedded soldier or embedded with soldiers headed into combat, essentially?
Yes, so even though the decision to actually go to war was made in spring of 2003, the Pentagon was preparing for it in fall of 2002. And they started about 5 classes of about 60 reporters each who went to Quantico, they went to Fort Dix. I was one of the Fort Dix people. And you went through a week's worth of survival training. You went through cold marches to understand what it would be like if you had to go march for 4 hours. You got to learn how the different weapons sounded, what you could handle them, and then at the same time you learned your personal safety. Reporters are pretty cavalier with their own information, and they just let us onto this base. We had no idea we were being surveilled the entire time by an Army Red Team that was learning from us. And so they gave us all itineraries. I left my itinerary on my bed. The itinerary was taken by someone. They left something, another reporter, was being very loose-lipped about, oh, we're going to make this movement now. And so the Red Team's goal was to kidnap one of the reporters and show us how to be more safe with our personal information, to keep our wallets, don't keep your plane reservations out, don't, all of that stuff. And so that was a huge learning experience.
Boy, that's really intense. And you didn't have any, did you at the beginning stages have any fear for your own personal safety, or was this, to use a military term, a mission that you were going on, a journalistic mission?
The only time I took time to contemplate was really when we were sitting, it's one of the opening scenes in The Warbird, and it's 10 o'clock at night, it's pitch dark. I'm in this Humvee with these 4 Texas airmen, and I realized just how much of a fish out of water I am. At the time I had covered Congress, I'd covered the Farm Bill, I'd covered, at that point I thought that the coolest thing you'd want to do as a reporter is go cover the White House. I had no idea why I was in a Humvee with 4 guys idling, kicking up dust, smelling exhaust fumes, and getting ready to go into Iraq. But after that, it was straight adrenaline for a few days, I think.
So in the book, you write about a sense of aliveness, a sense of belonging when you were embedded with those forces in Iraq. Talk to us a little bit about that feeling, that palpable feeling that you had.
When we initially got into the Humvee, there's me, a female reporter, and then there's 4 men who range in age from 19 to my age, 28. Who'd had a completely different life experience than I had. I graduated from college and couldn't wait to get to Washington, D.C., where I thought the power center was. And these were guys who had stayed in Texas and wanted to serve, and they were enlisted, and so they'd gone through bases in Texas. And they saw me very much as like the outside liberal media elite. And they to me were like, you know, the conservative Southerners who always thought that I was the liberal media elite. And so there was definitely a sense of awkwardness in those first couple of hours. But you're just stuck in this Humvee, and you know, you roll the window down, you ask if you can smoke. You start talking about past. You start to break down these barriers. And by the first night, the guys were kind of treating me like I was one of theirs. We had ended up at this hangar that had been bombed in the previous war, and that's where everyone took shelter for the night. And the guys actually formed a protective circle around me to make sure that I wasn't messed with by anybody else. And it was so touching, and it's an extraordinarily humble experience to realize what they're doing and that they're still thinking about taking care of you.
How long were you there, embedded?
So the first time it was through from the invasion to a couple weeks after mission accomplished. I was actually in Baghdad at Al-Fa Palace when all of the generals got together to say combat ops were essentially over and we were now going to be moving into the restoration phase. I came home in May, and you know, you go through this adrenaline rush, completely simplified way of living, where the only thing you have to worry about is, have you done your story? Have you bathed? Have you gone to the bathroom? You know, very simple. And then you get back and injected back into DC, where there's a whole lot of other things to worry about. What do people think of you? How much is it going to cost to like get this latte? Do you want this flavor of latte or the other 100 flavors of lattes that they have? Instead of like, here's my MRE,
Yeah.
and that's all. It was really disorienting.
So did you come back a changed person in any way?
I'm sure I did, but I didn't understand that until I looked back on it years later. I mean, I came back just still going 100 miles an hour and wanting to be very expressive emotionally. We went out drinking a bunch with friends, like, hey, let's celebrate. I stayed very good friends with all of the Texans that had come up to Washington. And so a couple weeks after we got back, there was a big party where all the Texans get on the bus together and we go drink in a field out in Virginia. And on the way back, I saw the Washington Monument, I saw the flags, and I was just breaking down, bawling, crying, and no one could figure out why. And I realized that nobody else on the bus could really feel this deep sense of patriotism, and I felt like I was in the wrong place. I felt like I shouldn't be on that bus. I felt like I should be back in Iraq. The guys were still there.
A lot of veterans relate the very same experience or feelings and emotions.
Yeah, I think it's obviously still tough to this day to think about it. And, you know, Iraq is a war that hasn't ended, really.
Yeah.
We did withdraw in 2011, but now forces are back. It is much harder to get back there to report. But there's just this sense of like this story has not ended yet, and now it's expanded. There's now forces in Syria. You know, there were forces in Niger. We've got air campaigns going on in 8 different countries right now, and there hasn't been a sense of, okay, this was completed. There's some closure here.
Yeah. We need to take a quick moment for station identification. This is Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. An audio version of the show can be heard 3 times each weekend on Sirius XM Satellite Radio's popular POTUS channel. That's the Politics of the United States, channel 124. You can also download the episode anytime on the Sirius XM app. Story in the Public Square is produced at the studios of Rhode Island PBS in Providence, Rhode Island. The crew here is world class, and we're lucky to work with them. I'm Jim Ludis, and I run the Pell Center for International Relations and Public Policy at Salve Regina University in beautiful Newport, Rhode Island. You can find me on Twitter at JMLudis. To my right, my friend and co-host is G. Wayne Miller. He's the author of 17 books and an award-winning journalist at the Providence Journal. You can connect with Wayne on Twitter. He's at G. Wayne Miller, all one word. And our guest this week is the Pentagon Bureau Chief for the Military Times and author of The Warbird, a memoir that weaves together her experience as a journalist in Iraq with the history of her family in the Second World War. She's on Twitter too, at Tara Copp. That's C-O-P-P with 2 P's. So, Tara, let's talk about the book, The Warbird. I loved this book. I was sort of fawning all over you in the green room because I was really moved by this, and it's a remarkable story that weaves together your experience and almost trying to make sense of it, of your experience through understanding your grandfather's war. Talk to us about how the process began to actually tell this story.
So when I came back and I was telling you about those first initial weeks, I was really off kilter. And for me, a safe place I've always gone to is my grandmother's house. She's from Chile, so we call her Abuela. And so I'd go to Abuela's house, and whenever I was breaking up with someone or just needed to kind of reset, she was my reset button, and she lived in Carlsbad, California. So I went out there to, I had a couple weeks off. My news organization gave me a little bit of time off. And she said, your grandfather wrote about the war too, which is not something I'd ever heard. I knew that my grandfather was a World War II hero. I saw pictures of him in uniform on the walls of their home. But he had died when I was 15, when I was really too young to appreciate the war stories I could have gotten from him had I known to ask. And so she started digging around in her coffee table, and she found this big dusty stack of papers. And they're all paper clipped, and they had not been touched since he died because the paper clips literally were just exact one on top of the other.
That's amazing.
And she just kept them because she didn't feel like going back to his war story either. After he had passed away, she had taken care of the home and kept things going and was reestablishing her life. But until I went to Iraq, she hadn't really thought about revisiting that chapter either, except for the beautiful medals on the wall and the pictures of him looking good in his uniform and things like that.
What motivated him to write those memoirs? I mean, a lot of people buried that war. A lot of people lived in the glory they might have had, but not a whole lot of people, unless they were publishing something, came back and wrote such a thing. What motivated him?
Well, he started to write about his life in the last 2 years of his life, when his health was failing. He had a bunch of long-term, lifelong injuries related to war service, related to a life spent drinking. His final years were not good ones. He had diabetes, dementia. These memories would come in and out for him. And so my grandmother just sat beside him and would type out the memories as he would say, well, this happened. And it was almost like recalling a painting or an image in his head. And so the papers themselves, while this was World War II, there would be splotches of images. There was not one connected, we went on this mission and then this was our leader and this was the date. There was none of that. It was almost like his war was there, but it was kind of lost.
So, I'm putting my Hollywood hat on now, and I could see that as a movie. Your grandfather and your grandmother doing that. Amazing. And great that he did, too.
You wrote, though, that you carried this image of your heroic grandfather into the Iraqi desert with you. And it was the sort of romanticized, idealized version of the World War II hero, who the war is clear and the cause is just, and the victory is unequivocal, right? That romantic ideal did not survive your experience in Iraq.
Not at all. My own experience in Iraq, I came back really kind of with a sense of shame because I ended up getting together with one of the soldiers that I covered after a fairly intense experience on the battlefield. And when I looked in my grandfather's memoirs, he had done the exact same thing. And so instead of seeing this narrative of, and we dived on this target and saved a village, he goes at length to describe the women that he slept with. Mm-hmm. And to me, my cheeks just turned crimson. One, I thought, all right, the apple doesn't fall very far from the tree. And two, I thought, well, this isn't the war hero I was looking for. When I went to Iraq, I was like, well, my grandfather served, and we can probably all thank Hollywood for the ideals we have in our head about the greatest generation. And yes, they did amazing things, and they made unbelievable sacrifices, but they were still human, and they made mistakes right and left, and they were unfaithful, and they got broke or they got drunk, as my grandfather did. They're humans, but that didn't make their war story any less important.
And that seems to be the if there's a meta narrative to what you've written, is that there is I think there's a line in the book where you said that the war is no greater and no less than the people who fight it, and they're all human beings. And so there's almost I can see you making peace with your own experience through learning that you weren't an outlier, you were just like everybody else.
It was, if there was a gift that he gave me after his passing, it was that understanding. And I only got that by going through every single one of those dusty papers and then deciding that I was going to rebuild his war by going to the National Archives and finding the dates and the missions that were behind those papers. So I would take his fuzzy memory, and then I would ask, historians for help on, all right, what were the bomb groups that were at this part of England? And we finally would, hone down to what the possibilities were. And after a couple of months of doing this, I finally found his name in the stacks for the first time. And I just stood up and did this. You have to be very quiet in the archives. But I did this little happy dance, and tears were streaming down my cheeks.
That's amazing.
And just the fact that I had found him, and I was making contact with a document that had his name on it, and showed the men that he was with that day and what happened to their bomber, was an unbelievable feeling.
I mean, it was a direct connection to what happened.
Yes.
I mean, it had to have been. I just want to read a little bit from the book, because I find the writing in this passage poetic and very moving. And this talks about going into Iraq. On that disorienting first trip into the desert, all of life's extraneous noise got ripped away. It was an addictive, clean feeling that was just as fleeting as it was intense.
I spent the next several years stumbling around, reaching again for that rush. But it was nowhere to be found. Not back with the men I'd first gone in with. Not in the desert. It was a purity that blindsided me when I first experienced it, and then became less tactile and less true each time I thought about that first trip in. But there was a competing feeling too. It was discomforting to realize I'd felt so alive in a place so riddled with loss. More, that I'd been able to leave without paying the price so many others did. I began to question if I treated war like something that could be visited in denial, like a junkie.
Talk about the sentiment behind that. I mean, that's very moving.
Thank you. It's very true. When the 4 airmen I initially went in with were coming home, and I was already so disoriented, and as I wrote, just kind of stumbling around, looking for that rush, looking for connection, looking for purpose, because in the desert, purpose seemed so clear. It was simple. There was a mission. Everybody had their job. Everybody had their role. And then you come back and you wonder, what's the greater purpose? And so I actually kind of chased the guys back to San Angelo, Texas when they were coming home, thinking that if I could just reconnect with them, well, we can redefine and we can get back to true. But that did not end well. And it was kind of the first hint that I had that we're all human, and they were just 4 young men who were really looking forward to being back in San Angelo with all of its college of pretty women, and didn't necessarily want to, come and spend time with me. They'd seen me in the desert. We didn't, didn't need to do that back here in San Angelo. That was even more disorienting, but it was my first real hint of whatever you're expecting to find here, it's not here. So keep looking. And ultimately, that's what got me to looking for my grandfather's war story, because I thought, well, maybe the answers were there. And they were there. They just weren't the answers I was expecting. And the answers that I finally found, that war is imperfect. The people that are caught up in it are imperfect. And it brought me a sense of ease to stop looking for that adrenaline rush or that sense of the purpose, or whether I'd let myself down or let others down.
Was there one moment when you first felt that ease? Was it sort of an epiphany, or did it sort of evolve? And I'm guessing this occurred during the writing, or at least during the reporting of the book.
I think it was gradual over time, but there were moments where I felt like, okay, I'm getting a little bit more back to true, because it took long enough to build his entire war story that I really doubted I was ever going to do it. And that became more of a self-doubt, like, well, if I can't really understand everything that happened here, then I'm not going to figure out my own war story. So actually getting to completion and coming to terms with the fact that there are missions of his I will never find. And I'll never get the full answer about what he thought that day or why it was easier to, be with a pretty Italian girl than it was to be, doing his job on any particular day. But it very much drove the point home that the young men and women that we send to war are human. And they have heartache and loss, and they are also seeking their own sense of purpose, and they're there to serve the country, and they're going to make mistakes.
I'm curious how this experience, not just the experience of being in bed, but the journey of discovery that you were on in this book, how this is, you're a working journalist now, you're the Pentagon Bureau Chief for the Military Times. How has this experience changed you as a reporter? Has it changed you as a reporter?
I think it, for one, that initial experience and then the experience of writing this book, I think when I first started covering war, I tended to put people in uniform on a pedestal. I think the entire nation does. And through just repeat exposure and through the process of writing this, you realize they don't belong on a pedestal unless they earn being on a pedestal just like anyone else in the country. They do serve, they do sacrifice, but so do teachers, so do police officers, so do firefighters, so do auditors.
Unless your taxes are being audited.
Yeah.
We'll make an exception for that.
And it has empowered me, I think, to look with a much clearer eye at being able to ask, why are we doing this? Is this the right thing? Are these dollars being spent correctly? I think if more of us had been able to have that distance a long time ago, maybe we could have avoided some of the waste and some of the unnecessary loss that we've experienced.
That's a profound lesson. There's no question. Did your war experience give you a certain degree of respect when you began to work in the Pentagon for the Military Times among the civilians
Honestly,
and officers you met there?
every single person in there has been out to
So,
Iraq and Afghanistan at this
Even
point.
even journalists who were there.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, there's a very deep bench of people that have spent their careers going out there and being side by side with the men and women in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is really unique to our reporting corps. When we first went, I was told only 7% of the military had seen combat. Well, even less than that in the reporting corps. I mean, the last time that they'd had like an embedded operation, I think, was Grenada. And now you have this whole deep bench of reporters that have been there, they know what to expect. You have actually a number of soldiers and former military personnel that have now become journalists.
And it changes the way the reporting's done.
Yeah.
Tara Copp, it is a remarkable book. It's The Warbird. Thank you so much for being with us. We're out of time this week, but if you want to know more about Storing the Public Square, you can always find us on Facebook and Twitter, or you can visit us at pellcenter.org, where you can also watch previous episodes. For G. Wayne Miller, I'm Jim Ludis, asking you to join us again next week for another edition of Storing the Public Square.